Louise Shure. I was the regional director for Palm Beach County for the Anti-Defamation League from 1983 to 1996. I arrived in this area and found a very quiet, small Jewish community.
In what year?
1983.
Okay, and I'm Sandi Altner. I am a volunteer with the Boca Raton Historical Society and Museum, and we are embarking on a project to capture the oral histories of the Jewish community here in South Florida, particularly in Boca Raton, of course. And we're very pleased, Louise, that you were able to join us today. Today is February 10th, 2016, and we are in the beautiful studios at Lynn University, and which is, of course, here in Boca Raton. So why did you move from New Haven, Connecticut to Boca Raton?
My youngest son was about to go off to college. I was alone. I had been divorced 5 years earlier. I had been working for the New Haven Jewish Federation in Community Relations, and I ran the Connecticut State Community Relations Council, which was composed of 9 federations in Connecticut. Did all their monitoring, did all their lobbying at that time, and was doing very well. And the Anti-Defamation League came to me and said, "Would you like to go to Florida?" And I said, "I always wanted to go to Florida." And my kids, my 3 boys were, in college and moving on. They were settled. So I picked up and came to this area in February of 1983.
When you say this area, specifically, where did you
come?
Well,
the ADL office was located at that time in West Palm Beach. And, but I moved to Boca because it worked out for my husband and I it was a good location for us. At that time, the Boca Federation had just split from the Palm Beach Jewish Federation. Up to about 1982, it was one federation. And the Boca Raton community felt that they were strong enough and independent enough to form their own federation. So I was there at the ground roots of the Boca Raton Jewish Federation, which was also an interesting aspect. And I was involved in their Community Relations Council as the ADL representative. And I joined Temple Bethel when I met Rabbi Merle Singer, who seemed to have a perfect outreach for community relations and interfaith activities.
Okay, I want to talk with you about so many of these different experiences that you've had. So let's go at them a little bit one at a time. First of all, as an individual moving down here, did you move here specifically for the ADL job then, as you said?
I did.
And did you have anyone in the community that you knew at that time?
I had a couple of dear friends who, from New Haven, had moved to this area, and so I knew a few people, and it was an adventure. Being single, I found a number of single social groups, tennis groups, and I met a lot of single people. My ADL board was very warm and in giving me a welcome, inviting me to their homes for dinner parties and to all sorts of events at Kravis once it opened, before that the Palm Beach Theater. So, and to art, at the Norton. So I was very well welcomed.
And you transitioned well, it sounds like.
I didn't even think about it. I just plunged ahead.
Now, was your first home here then in West Palm then, Louise?
Yes, I was there for about 2 years in West Palm. And then I met my husband-to-be, and he was working in the Boca area, and we decided to move to Boca. And we moved to Boca West. I saw the trees. We moved. We were looking for a place to live. We went in, and I saw these wonderful oak trees. And I said, "I'm going where the trees are."
What was your husband's name?
His name was Jim Schottland.
And when you were first married there and settling in Boca,
yeah.
What was it that you found here? What year was it that you and your husband moved to Boca Raton?
1986.
Okay. And what kind of community was Boca at that time? What kind of a Jewish community did you find here?
It was a quiet Jewish community. It firmly believed that religion should be practiced in the home and in the synagogue. I found a community that was worried about schools, whether their kids would be accepted as Jews, whether the teachers understood Jewish kids, because there were incidents where there were invocations where they whoever was giving the invocation, whether it was a student or a visiting lecturer or clergy, who would invoke the name of JC, which was, and I'd go to meet with the school officials, and they'd say, well, so-and-so says he can't open a prayer unless he uses that invocation. It's basic to the prayer. And I would explain to them that it made the Jewish kids feel different and outside the group. So there was a lot of education to do with the teachers. ADL had a national project called A World of Difference, which we started to work with the various teachers to have them understand that all kids come from different backgrounds, and their backgrounds, their heritage, their religious beliefs should be recognized and accepted.
You're talking about 1986.
1983, 1986. The other thing is that this area was a southern state. It was slow to adopt a lot of the fair housing laws. It was slow to adopt school desegregation. So it was still the schools were under a court order still when I arrived.
Describe what segregation in the schools was at that time for people who are not familiar with that.
Okay, there were schools for black kids and schools for white kids. And the laws came down that schools had to desegregate. And it was a slow process. A lot of parents, white parents, pulled their kids out of public schools and started private schools. So integrating the schools was not easy. And it did have an effect on some of the schools.
Did desegregation happen then prior to you coming in the early
Yes,
80s?
yes.
But not
so totally, because it was still under a 10-year court order to desegregate because it was moving so slowly.
How would you describe, Louise, what the Jewish community looked like to Jewish people arriving in the early 80s here? You mentioned it being a quiet community and so
Right.
on. Was it hard to find Jewish people here?
Well, if you joined a synagogue or a temple, you found them right away because they were there, they were welcoming. There were activities through the temple, through the synagogue that you could go to. ADL ran a number of activities, a number of lectures in the various communities. I was in all the communities between Boca and Palm Beach, the residential communities. I was at Hadassah meetings. I was at Federation meetings. I was all over.
What was the core purpose of the Anti-Defamation League at that time when you were here from starting in 1983?
Okay, one was to Jewish security, prime. Jews had to feel safe. They had to be secure, and we did that in a number of ways. Education was a big plus. Legislation, when we pushed for the hate crime laws to make it a crime and then increase the felony aspects if somebody committed a hate crime versus a regular crime. There was a lot of education among the Jewish communities that they too should understand that they are proud Americans, that they are accepted as Jewish Americans. There was a lot of bringing to the front the hate groups that existed in this area. There was still an old Klan group, and I would get calls from people who lived out near Lake Worth that they would see the white robes hanging on the laundry lines on Monday morning.
Was that something that was kind of a separate group that was involved directly in anti-Semitic activity at that time?
Yes. I mean,
how so? What did that? How did it manifest itself?
They would have some marches, and push white supremacy. There was some neo-Nazi groups. One of the leaders, he's still a leader, Don Black, lived in lived in this area. They would get on talk radio, not so much TV, but talk radio always welcomed people who had controversial views. And there was also a Jewish Defense League that sometimes came out and protested, that the Jewish community wasn't speaking out loud enough.
So there were complex issues in
Yes.
terms of the hate crimes and so on.
Right.
Did you think at that time that the average Jewish person here would feel the impact of anti-Semitism at that time?
That's an interesting question because people felt that they were well aware in Boca Raton of the Royal Palm community, which, because of the public housing laws, they had to sell houses to Jews, but they didn't have to admit them to their private clubs. And there were a number of people who bought houses in Royal Palm and then discovered that their kids couldn't swim at the country club, the kids couldn't join the tennis team. It was outright anti-Semitism and segregation. And we worked very hard on that issue. We finally discovered that some of the waterways that ran through Royal Palm belonged to the state, and the state had a right of way. So we were talking to the state about taking away the rights of the people who lived in Royal Palm to use those waterways when they suddenly slowly began to accept Jews into their clubs. It started with families that, one child had married a Jew, and it's slowly opened up.
Was that something that you saw also in other neighborhoods in Boca?
Not so much. The country clubs that were developing at that time were open. IBM had a tremendous number of people who lived in the western part of and when I'm talking about western, it was sort of cut off at Power Line. Glades Road was 2 lanes. Power Line, Yamato stopped at Power Line except to let people get to Woodfield Country Club. There was no bridge across Palmetto past Power Line. I mean, it was a much smaller community, and but the housing was open. Basically, the housing laws had taken effect so that Jews could really live anywhere they wanted.
The Jews moved into a community that was primarily populated by whom?
Well, when I moved to Boca West, I would say that maybe there was 30% Jewish community. Today it's about 90%.
So when we look at, but who were the people who made up this community prior to the Jewish migration to Boca, starting in the 70s, if you will?
Okay, the bishop of this area told me an interesting story. He said people from the west, from Michigan and that area, when they drive to Florida, they drive down the west coast and they settle there. The people who come from the east go down the east coast and they settle there. The Jews who came down the east coast went all the way to Miami and then started to move back up towards Boca. There were always a few pioneers in West Palm and in Boca who opened stores because there was a need. There was a need for merchandise and stores, and there was also a need for doctors. A number of Jews who settled had come with World War II. They worked at when Boca was this area
Was a military base?
Military base, and did a lot of radar work. So a number of them were doctors and other professionals associated with the military who liked the area. Now keep in mind, air conditioning didn't come in until the late, the 70s, so it was very hard to live here in the summer. So the early people who used to come were winter tourists, whether it was Palm Beach or whether it was Boca, the Boca Ocean area. They would come for 4 or 5 months, and then when the weather got hot and the mosquitoes came out, they would go home.
Do you think Jackie Gleason had an impact on the settlement of Florida because of his program? I mean, just thinking out of Miami and a way for people who were in New York to learn about, and everywhere, of course.
Right. Well, I mean, there was the Borscht Belt in New York, and then the comedians came to Miami during the winter. They had audiences. Jackie Gleason probably hired a lot of people to work for him. Where there's work and there's jobs, Jews can get hired, they will come. I didn't hear too much about job discrimination by 1983. Doors were open in the most part for people who had the skills and the techniques and the training to work and willing to work hard.
Why do you think, Louise, that Boca Raton, Florida became such an attractive place for Jews to settle?
It was an expanding community. There was a welcome out to people in the professions because the schools were okay. It was safe. It offered a good Jewish life because as temples and synagogues started to flourish, Jewish schools started to flourish. It was as my stepdaughter from Sfat, Israel, says when she comes to visit, she says, your markets, your Jewish markets are so much better than what I get in Sfat.
So it's easy to be a Jew here today?
Very easy to be a Jew. And of course, we've gone from very quiet, private celebrations to menorahs and all the lobbies of condominiums, menorahs, and Bethel had a wonderful Hanukkah candlelight ceremony a couple of years ago at Meisner. They do Israel Independence Day down at Meisner. The wide community can participate in Jewish events.
Let's talk a little bit about the Jewish community and the anti-Semitism change over the years. Could you tell us a little bit how you would compare what you saw in the early 1980s in this region, and particularly in Boca, and how it may have changed to now 2016?
Okay, well, don't forget, as I said, the Jews were silent, quiet. There were a lot of people living in Boca in the years where IBM was the main employer, and they brought in people, people who had all sorts of experience, people who worked with Jews, Jews who worked with a wide variety of non-Jews. It encouraged professionals, lawyers, accountants, doctors, dentists to come in because there was a growing population. So it was like an open door for people who had skills and people who wanted to live a Jewish life. There was no restrictions.
Today, what would you say is the greatest difference in Boca from those early years when you came with your husband?
Well, I would say the population, the Jewish population, is overwhelming. The number of synagogues, the number of Jewish organizations, the number of Jewish schools, day schools, there's no end, and the Jewish Federation campus. When I came, the Federation, as I said, just split with the Palm Beach Federation. They had a small building on Spanish River, and then they decided to move west. They got the land to start the Jewish campus. And when I was there on Sunday to look at what they've done with Cyanide and how many people are going to be moving into this this residence is overwhelming.
And this is a residence for elderly people?
Elderly people, right.
Right. I wanted to go back a little bit more to talk about some of the other types of anti-Semitism that were here in the early years so that we can well understand what a change that is.
Right.
And so in terms of having a Jewish community outside of the synagogue and for people who were not affiliated with synagogues, was it easy to find a challah? Was it easy to feel Jewish in the community if you were not affiliated to a synagogue?
Well, there was always markets. Del Rey had a big kosher market way back. You could at the bakeries. There were bakeries, good Jewish bakeries. You could. Publix was way behind. They didn't have the Jewish foods that you find there now. Now you can walk into any supermarket in this area, and there's a big Jewish section of food.
So there's a comfort level that has come with progress.
Right.
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 Now, there's a certain identity that every community would have because it's shaped by the people who come to live there. With the overwhelming migration of Jewish people to come to Florida, and some are affiliated, some are not, some are religious, some are not, some are cultural Jews, some are non-religious Jews entirely. So I'm just thinking that, how would you say the Jewish community has made its greatest stamp on this area? Is it in business? Has it shaped Boca Raton in business, for example? Let's talk a bit about that.
Probably. There, there's a lot of businesses. There's people in all sorts of professions, whether it's computer, or law, or medicine, or look at the Boca Raton Regional Hospital has grown tremendously. The 2 universities, outstanding. When I first came, Lynn was a small college that put a lot of emphasis on hospitality. When I first used to go to FAU, I would get lost on the old runways. So the impact of bringing in departments of Jewish education in both Lynn and FAU have been extraordinary. The number of Jewish students who used to go to Lynn and FAU was very small. The Hillels were tiny. Now the number of Jewish students at both schools have grown. They feel more welcome because there's Jewish studies. Lynn has done a tremendous job in researching the Nuremberg trials with Rabbi Jessica Brockman from Bethel. FAU has a big Holocaust department also. All these, I think the educational facilities have attracted Jewish professors, Jewish educators. And going back, I'm just thinking about the number of people who came originally to this area, lots and lots of retired educators.
So these individual things, all these different stories you have, really add up to a substantial change in the community that happened over a relatively short period of time. Boca became a Jewish community, it seems almost overnight, but only because massive numbers of people started to come. What was it that you think really caused those big numbers? Like, when did we hit that tipping point?
It's hard to tell. I think, it began way back with the beginnings of Century Village and Kings Point, which opened up 3,500, 4,000 residents in both sections, and those got big Jewish populations. As the developers began to keep building, they were building products that Jewish families wanted. A lot of families out of New York went for the communities that had villas. They had lived in apartment houses all their lives, and suddenly they could live on a piece of grass and have some tennis, have a lake, have places to hike and walk, bird watch. It opened up. It was a perfect change from city living.
So with all of that and the early promoters, we'll call them, of Boca Raton as a welcoming place for the Jewish community, did you feel that as you were at the ADL those years ago that you were starting to see the shift just because the numbers of Jews had started to increase? Did that take care of some of the problems?
Well, and it raised more problems because there were, as more Jewish kids went into the public schools, there were incidents where kids felt that they were being treated not fairly by teachers. There were the questions of the school calendar that we had to deal with every year to make sure that schools were closed for the first day of Rosh Hashanah, for Yom Kippur. We had to make sure that kids who stayed out for the second day of Rosh Hashanah and some of the other holidays didn't get penalized and lose their perfect attendance records. There were, lots of little issues that had to be accommodated.
Do you think that Boca, in some ways, then has stood as an example to other communities that are growing stronger Jewish communities?
Probably. I think the boldness of the Boca Raton Jewish community has given courage to a lot of other communities to be proud and open about their Judaism.
So it must have been very interesting to see Boca transition from being a community where Judaism was quiet and in the home,
Right.
to coming out into Meisner Park and places like that.
Right.
How did you feel about that?
Well, at first when I saw the big menorahs on the cars going on those parades, I'm saying, what are they doing? Is this too much? And I was concerned that people would be upset by, a lot of public display of Jewish symbols, plus what it would open up to allow, beyond Christmas trees, we're talking creches and other Christian symbols on public property, because that's a very important issue for ADL. This country is not a Christian country. This country is for all people, and to make Christian symbols very visible would put in a new risk. So you had to balance your display of Jewish life with what other people wanted, other religions wanted on display for their religious life.
Do you think we have become, in 2016, a tolerant community?
I think on the most part, yes. There's still issues that come up. There's still people who report swastikas on markings on their house or key markings on their cars in certain neighborhoods. But I think Boca Raton now accepts the fact that it has a lot of Jewish residents.
We also have a very interesting community in that we have a growing Muslim population
Right.
here as well. What have the relations, insofar as the ADL's experience and your experience in the ADL, been between those two communities?
Well, as I said, I left the ADL in 1986, so a lot's happened in the last, that's 20 years. It's hard to believe it's 20 years. The Muslim community was not very visible in those years. I think they built the mosque maybe 8 years ago. And it's still, again, the mosque is very quiet. Not many people know that it's on 4th Avenue. Not many people know there's a mosque.
And several mosques now.
Several mosques.
Yes, and so as we've come, because when we look at all of the changes in the community, insofar as the Jewish community, what do you think Boca Raton's impression is to the outside world? Let's call it that. Like when people come here for holiday,
Right.
Tourists come to enjoy this region, what do they see when they get here?
They see beauty. They see a very clean, beautiful community. They see the ocean. They see wonderful facilities, lots and lots of golf courses, tennis courts, ball fields for the kids, a lot of shopping. Some people call it like, a la land, that it's too beautiful to be true.
It's also true it's a very wealthy community.
Right.
And that the enterprises of the Jewish community have certainly contributed to wealth, have contributed to philanthropy. What can you tell me about how important that philanthropy of the Jewish community has been to changing Boca Raton?
I think first of the outreach in the universities, the sponsorship of all sorts of programs between Lynn and FAU. I think of the arts, the bringing in of all the concerts, the Philharmonia here, the FAU arts programs. When I first came to this area, there was no music. I mean, there was no auditoriums for music. There was the art galleries were minimal. There's a huge expansion in the visual arts and the performing arts, because the people who live in Boca Raton can afford to go to the concerts, can afford to go to theater presentations, can afford to use all the sports facilities. It makes a big difference. You can't run all these programs if you don't have private money coming in.
When you look at what kind of a community this is today, and I'm thinking about your extended family and the tremendous experience you've had with the ADL, if that means to you that there's a different Boca that is worth promoting to your family, to come from far places away as they
Right.
are. Like, what do you tell them about the experience of living in Boca?
They laugh. They laugh. They think It's as I said, I think it's unreal. Like all my kids live in cities or near cities, and when I tell them, I say we have great things going on now at Lynn and at FAU. We have great things going on in music and art. They don't want to believe it because they think that we're still in a cultural wasteland. And I'll just go back when I told my friends, and I came from New Haven, Connecticut, and I worked with the Jewish Federation. I worked closely with a number of professors in the history department in the law department at Yale. They started the first Holocaust programming there. They would say, "What are you going to do? Your little brain cells are going to just fall apart. There's going to be no stimulation." And I mean, I laugh, and I'm just thinking about all the book clubs that go on here. Everybody you talk to is in 3 different book clubs. Everybody is busy reading. It's everybody's running to book and author luncheons. It's there's so much going on in terms of intellectual stimulation. And again, it's because people have the money to go to these events, and that keeps it going. They have the money to fund, Hadassah and the Federation and all the Jewish activities.
When that it's funny. There's a fellow that I talked with recently who said that he's from New York and he runs his business down here and in New York. And he said that he finds that after a while, he says there's only so long you can look at palm trees and the ocean and golf and so on. So he goes to New York every couple of months for therapy because he says he needs that hustle and bustle.
Well, it's an interesting issue you brought up because people now can work on their computer. They can scan documents. They can do video conferencing. You're not separated from the rest of the world when you lived here. When I first came, computers were just coming in. Communication was a telephone. So we live in a very, very different world. I have a son who lives in downtown Manhattan. I love going there a couple of times a year. I love walking the streets in New York, which I don't do here. Not where there's shops and there's people and there's, there are, you can walk around Meisner, you can walk around the Pink development. But it's not the same as living in a city. But I think we offer a tremendous amount of intellectual stimulation to people today.
You're obviously a very happy woman with a full life, and you've accomplished many, many things
Thanks.
with your work with the ADL. I'm just wondering if you can give me a couple of the highlights, just list a couple of the things that you're most proud of that the ADL was able to accomplish here with your work and the work that has been continuing with the ADL.
I think one is education, working from K up, even earlier, to reach out to kids to understand that we live in a world where we're all different and we have to respect each other's differences. That's a basic tenet of our American life. And 2, to expose those who hate, to bring them out into the sunshine and let people see what they're thinking and what they're doing. It's the best way to get rid of the haters.
What do you think still needs to happen? When you look forward to years that are coming and how Boca may continue to change, what do you see as a need for the community to address?
Well, one of the things is the poverty, the hidden poverty in this community. There's a lot of people who have very little, and I know the food pantries keep asking for more and more food. They ask for clothes so women can go out and be interviewed for jobs. Where I live, we have if people are busy moving or if they got a new set of dishes or something, they put their set of dishes or their pots or their outside, and the Haitian people who work on the golf course come by and pick it up. One of my clients was moving out, and she said she got a knock on the door because she put out her whole kitchen, and the gentleman was standing there. There were tears running down his eyes, and he said, "I have to thank you." He said, "I live in a bare house. I am bringing home your kitchen to my wife and my family." He said, "I thank you." And so we have wealth And sometimes we don't even think about enough how to make sure that others who have nothing can share in what we have.
When you look at all those years ago that you were faced with the prospect of being asked to move to Florida, and your first impressions of that idea, and now when you think back on that, what do you think? Was it a good decision?
I think it was a good decision. There were, you know, the downs are my kids are all scattered. They don't come. We don't see each other as much as I'd like to. But I don't think it would have made a difference if I was still in New Haven. Maybe that, you know, it'd be easier to get to, but it's still, your kids grow up, your grandchildren grow up and take jobs all over the place. So I'm very happy I came here. It has been a marvelous experience, and seeing the sunshine, physically seeing the sunshine, has been great for me.
Thank you so much, Louise. Louise Shure, for joining us today to talk about your experiences, and we wish you every success as you go forward with your book clubs and your plays and your music and everything else that you're involved with at this time. And thank you so much for your service to the community.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you so much.